We shall commence this module by discussing about the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy makes adjustment in the budget through the influence on the levels of aggregate demand. It comprises of government expenditure and taxation that government use to target the economic objectives, that is, to achieve economic growth, distributive justice, price stability and full employment in the country. The classical theory advocated the surplus budget when government spending was insufficient and remained confined to maintain law and order in the country or the functions of a policing of state. The revenues and expenditures were listed as few items on the budget. The developed countries took to balanced budget theory after the Second World War. The developing countries started advocating the theory of deficit budgets for development. Keynesian economics suggested that adjusting the government expenditure and tax rates can be used to stimulate the aggregate demand that encourages the economic activity during the periods of recession or budget deficit. The government can implement the deficit expenditure policies. During periods of high economic growth, a budget surplus can be used to decrease the activity in the economy. The expansion policies reduces the level of aggregate demand, bringing about the price stability. Budget deficit is an important variable and policy target. In USA and several other developed nations, the concept of budget deficit that was generally employed for analytical purposes has been the overall deficit taken to equal the difference between the total expenditure and the current revenues. This is also called fiscal deficit and has been adopted by IMF as the principal policy target in their programs. This module briefly examines the various concepts of budget deficits and its implications on the economy. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the meaning of budget and different views of the economist on budget deficit, to examine the different types of budget deficits, to understand the budget deficit and its implications, to understand the monetized deficit and its implications, to understand the revenue deficit and its implications, to understand the fiscal deficit and its implications, to understand the primary deficit and its implications. Next, we shall discuss about the government budget deficit and surplus. The budget is a large document that shows the details of all the items government plans to spend money on and all the sources of government revenues for the financial year. The budget of the government has two parts, revenue budget and capital budget. The revenue budget shows the revenue receipts and the revenue expenditures that are met from these revenues. Capital budget of the government comprises of the capital receipts and capital expenditures. It shows the capital requirement and their financial patterns. The difference between the receipts and its expenditure is the budget deficit or budget surplus, which is net national government savings. An excess of government expenditure over tax revenue is budget deficit. An excess of tax revenue over the government expenditure is a budget surplus. A balanced budget is when the government expenditure is exactly equals to the tax revenue. Budget deficit in the economy reduces the national savings. National savings is the sum of the private savings, that is savings of the households out of after tax income, and the public savings, that is the tax revenue that the government saves rather than spends. The sources of loanable funds. When the government runs a budget deficit, it results in dissavings. Public savings get reduced and becomes negative, that further reduces the national savings. Government financed the budget deficit by borrowing in the bond market. Borrowing when gets accumulated is the government debt. The borrowings are thus used to meet the expenditure needs, including servicing of the old debt. The supply of loanable funds available to the households and firms for investment gets reduced when the government borrows to finance the budget deficit. This increases the interest rate that alters the behavior of the household and the firms. It discourages the demanders of the loanable funds. The government borrowings crowd out the investment or the investment decreases. Since investment is important for the long run economic growth, budget deficit reduces the economy's growth rate. Government budget surplus works in the opposite direction. It saves the difference after meeting out the government debt. It increases the supply of loanable funds, reduces the interest rate and stimulates the investment and thus more economic growth. Algebraically, this can be explained using the accounting identities. SP is equals to Y minus T minus C and SG is equals to T minus G, where SP is the private savings and SG is the public savings. Y is the gross domestic product, that is GDP, T is the taxes, C is the private consumption, G is the government's expenditure. Then national savings, that is SN, would be equals to SP plus SG. Thus, SN would be equals to Y minus C minus G. This is given as equation 1. Given Y is equals to C plus I plus G plus NX, where C is consumption, I is investment, G is the government expenditure and NX is the net exports, substituting this equation in equation 1 of national savings, we get S is equals to I plus NX. This is given as equation 3. Therefore, the national saving is equals to the investment and the net exports. In other words, the overall fall in the investment and net exports essentially must match the overall fall in the national saving to the extent that budget deficit increases the trade deficit and creates a corresponding effect of increase in the flow of assets abroad. A rise in the interest rate also increases the demand for the domestic currency in the market for foreign exchange, causing the currency to appreciate. The appreciation of the currency in turn affects the trade in goods and services. Exports fall, import rises and the trade balance moves toward deficit. Thus, budget deficit reduces the national savings, which would reduce the investment and net exports. Let us now discuss the theoretical perspective of the budget deficit. Government deficits and government debt has become the most serious concern in both developed and developing countries. An extensive theoretical perspective has been developed to examine the budget deficit and its impact on the macroeconomic variables like savings, investment and growth. Amongst the mainstream analytical perspectives, the three distinct schools of thoughts on budget deficit are noteworthy and are as follows. First is the Neoclassical school of thought. The Neoclassical school considers the far-sighted individual planning their consumption over their own life cycle. Budget deficit raised the total lifeline consumption. It shifts the taxes to the future generations, increasing the current consumption. By assuming the full employment of resources, the Neoclassical school argues that increased consumption implies a decrease in saving. Interest rate must then rise to bring the equilibrium in the capital market. The higher interest rate with the budget deficit would crowd out the private investment. This would lead to a decline in private investment. The Neoclassical view considers the budget deficit detrimental to the investment and growth. Second is the Keynesian school of thought. The Keynesian school considers the fraction of population as either myopic or liquidity constrained. The individuals have high propensities to consume. The temporary tax reduction or increase in the government expenditure would increase the aggregate demand. As the resources are not fully employed, national income rises due to the multiplier effect. This increases the interest rates. The increase in the interest rate would partially offset the multiplier effect. However, it would neutralize by the profitability of investments. The budget deficit have expansionary effects as it results in increase in production, which makes the investors more optimistic in investment. This leads to crowding in effect. The budget deficit stimulate both consumption and national income. Savings and investments are not adversely affected despite of the increase in the interest rate. This is due to employment of unutilized resources. However, in the Keynesian paradigm, if the resources are fully employed, then it would lead to crowding out of investment. Thus, the short-term effect of appropriately timed budget deficits are beneficial. Third is the Ricardian equivalence school of thought. The Ricardian equivalence approach, advanced by Barrow in 1989, conceives of far-sighted, fully informed, altruistic individuals. They argue that an increase in budget deficit because of an increase in the government expenditure must be paid for either today or tomorrow. The total present value of the receipts is fixed by the total present value of the expenditure. Thus, a reduction in the present taxes must be equal to an increase in the future taxes, leaving the interest rates and thus the private investment unchanged. Thus, deficits do not have any impact on the aggregate demand and helps in smoothing of the expenditure or revenue shocks. Thus, it is noteworthy that among three schools, one can find support for every conceivable normative position. The budget deficit is good, bad or irrelevant depending on the choice of an analytical perspective. The Neoclassical and the Ricardian put emphasis on the long run, whereas Keynesian on the short run effect. Moving on to discuss the types of budget deficit. Budget deficit concept admits of the several variations and yields divergent types of budget deficit. Each type has analytical and policy relevance. According to the World Bank, the choice of the correct measure depends upon the purpose of analysis. There can be different types of deficit in a budget depending upon the types of receipts and expenditure taken into consideration. Accordingly, there are various concepts of budget deficit, namely, first, overall budget deficit, second, revenue deficit, third, fiscal deficit, fourth, primary deficit, and fifth, monetized deficit. Let us discuss the overall budget deficit. The conventional measure of the budget deficit or overall budget deficit, which is the difference between the total expenditure and the total receipts. Overall budget deficit is equals to total expenditure minus total revenue. This measure was significant to determine the growth of liquidity and inflationary pressures in the economy. The deficit is covered by the borrowing or monetized by the central bank, say the Reserve Bank of India, in India. The deficit is only financed through the short-term sources that includes 91 days treasury bills held by both the RBI and the non-RBI entities. In the presence of the system of the automatic monetization of deficits through issuance of ad hoc treasury bills, this measure of deficit becomes an important target to keep in check. However, in the year 1997, the government discontinued the issuance of ad hoc treasury bills. Instead, a scheme of ways and means advances popularly known as WMA by the RBI, was introduced to cover the deficit. As a result of this, the concept of budget deficit in the traditional sense lost its significance in the public finance, that is, as an indicator of short-term requirements of the funds or extent of monetization. Thus, budget deficit since 1997-98 budget was not reportedly in the budget documents of the Government of India and was discontinued. Next is monetized deficit. Monetized deficit is that part of the government deficit which is solely financed by the RBI. It indicates the quantum of additional money created as a result of the credit extended to RBI. When the government has a significant amount of outstanding debt, it can purchase its own debt with new printed money and thus monetized part of its debt. This is financed by borrowing both short and the long term from the RBI. The supply of money exceeds its demand, driving up the prices, leading to the inflationary consequence. Thus, monetized deficits are an important indicator of the inflationary impact of the increase in the government's budgetary deficit. The significance of this deficit is that it is important to regulate and, if necessary, to reduce the monetized deficit to control the inflationary pressures. Third is revenue deficit. Revenue deficit is excess of total revenue expenditure of the government over its total revenue receipts. Revenue deficit signifies that government's own revenue is insufficient to meet normal functioning of the government departments and provisions of services. Revenue deficit is equals to total revenue expenditure minus total revenue receipts. Revenue deficit means dis-savings on the government account. The government should maintain surplus in the revenue budget so that it increases the savings in the economy. The deficit is to be met from capital receipts, that is, through borrowings and sale of its assets or disinvestment. Increased borrowing would lead to increase in the interest payments, which in turn necessitate larger borrowings. The economy would move in the vicious circle. The borrowed funds from the capital account are used to meet generally the consumption expenditure of the government, leading to inflationary situation in the economy. Thus, revenue deficit may result either in increasing government liabilities or in reducing the government assets. A high revenue deficit warrants that the government either to curtail its expenditure and avoid unnecessary or unproductive expenditure or increase its tax and non-tax receipts. In the Indian context, a new term, effective revenue deficit, was introduced in the central budget 2011 and 12. It is the difference between the revenue deficit and grants for creation of capital assets. It is also the amount of capital receipts that are being used for the actual consumption expenditure of the government. This is a new parameter and same is targeted to be eliminated by the 31st March of 2015 as per the amendment made in 2012 to Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act known as FRBM Act. However, the 14th Finance Commission observed that the concept of effective revenue deficit is not recognized in the standard government accounting process. The Commission recommended that the central government should consider making an amendment to the FRBM Act to omit the definition of effective revenue deficit from 1st April 2015. Fourth is the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit has replaced the traditional measure of overall budget deficit. Until 80s, the fiscal policy focused primarily on the overall budget deficit or deficit financing. With the discontinuation of the budget deficit, fiscal deficit became the key indicator of the deficit. This is widely used as a summary indicator of the macroeconomic impact of the budget in several developed countries. Fiscal deficit has been adopted by IMF as the principal policy target in their programs. In India, the government began to report the fiscal deficit only after 1991. Fiscal deficit is defined as the difference between the total expenditure including loans net of repayment and the revenue receipts plus non-debt capital receipts. It indicates the total borrowings requirement of the government from all sources, that includes domestic sources like public and commercial banks, or from World Bank, IMF, or from RBI. Fiscal deficit is equals to total expenditure minus total receipts excluding borrowings is equals to net borrowings of the government. Borrowings of the government create problem of not only increase in the interest payment but also of the liability to repay the loans. The interest payment increases the revenue expenditure, creating a higher revenue deficit. The government would be compelled to borrow more lending to emergence of debt trap. Increasing the fiscal deficit over a period of time means government expenditure is rising faster than its revenue. A rapid increase in the public debt would increase the debt GDP ratio, which would have harmful effects. Government can also borrow from RBI, which meets this demand by printing of more currency notes called as deficit financing. It results in circulation of more money. This may cause inflationary pressures in the economy, leading to retardations of the economic growth as the borrowings crowds out the private investment. Thus, it is necessary to monitor and regulate the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is advantageous if it creates new capital assets that increase the future income. In India, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, that is FRBM Act, was passed by the Parliament in 2003. The aim of this act was to remove the revenue deficit of the government. It binds the government to fix the fiscal and revenue deficit targets for itself. The implementation of Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act during the period of 2005 and 10 had helped the centre and state government to reduce their fiscal deficit to a considerable extent. However, during the global slowdown years, that is 2008-9 and 2009 and 10, expansionary fiscal policy resulted in the fiscal deficit moving up significantly. The 13th Finance Commission had proposed a target of attaining a 3% fiscal deficit for central government by 2013-14 and for state governments in stages and in a manner that all states would attain 3% fiscal deficit by 2014-15. The 14th Finance Commission recommended the centre to maintain its fiscal deficit at 3.6% of the GDP for 2015 and 16 from 4.1% in 2014-15 and then maintain it at 3% for the following 4 years. According to the present Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, the 3% fiscal deficit target will now be achieved in 3 years as against the FRBM target of 2 years, that is, as per the new roadmap for the fiscal consolidation, fiscal deficit will be 3.9% of GDP in 2015-16, 3.5 in 2016-17 and 3% by 2017 and 18. Next is the primary deficit. Primary deficit is defined as the fiscal deficit of the current year minus the interest payment on the previous borrowings. That is, primary deficit is equals to fiscal deficit minus interest payments. In other words, primary deficit indicates borrowing requirement exclusive of interest payment. The borrowing requirement of the government includes the accumulated debt and interest payments on the debt. If interest payment on debt is deducted from borrowing, the balance is called primary deficit. It shows how much government borrowing is going to meet the expenses other than the interest payments. It also shows the net increase in the government indebtedness due to the current year's fiscal operations. A reduction in the primary deficit is reflective of government's efforts at bridging the fiscal gap during a financial year. Thus, zero primary deficit means that the government has to resort to borrowings only to make interest payments. Thus, primary deficit is a narrower concept and a part of fiscal deficit because the latter also includes the interest payment. It is generally used as the basic measure of the fiscal irresponsibility. Now, we will summarize what we have discussed in this module. The budget is a large document that shows the detail of all the items, government expenditure and all the sources of the government revenues for the financial year. The difference between the government receipts and expenditure is the budget deficit or budget surplus, which is net national government saving. A budget deficit is an excess of government expenditure over tax revenue. A budget surplus is an excess of the tax revenue over the government expenditure. If government expenditure is exactly equals to the tax revenue, then it is known as balanced budget. Government budget deficits reduces the national saving, reduces the investment, reduces the net exports and create a corresponding flow of assets abroad. The budget deficit is good, bad or irrelevant depending on the choice of the analytical perspective. The Neoclassical and Ricardian focus on the long run, whereas Keynesian on the short run effects. Depending upon the receipts and expenditures of the government, there can be different types of deficit that can be taken into consideration. The traditional measures of budget deficit or overall budget deficit, which is the difference between the total expenditure and total receipts. Monetized deficit is that part of the deficit of the government which is solely financed by the RBI. It indicates the quantum of the additional money created as a result of the credit extended to RBI. Revenue deficit is the excess of the total revenue expenditure of the government over its total revenue receipts. Fiscal deficit is defined as the difference between the revenue receipts plus non-debt capital receipts and total expenditure including loans net of repayment. It indicates the total borrowing requirement of the government from all sources, that includes domestic sources like public and commercial banks or from World Bank, IMF or from RBI. In India, reduction in the relative size of the fiscal deficit has gained momentum since 80s. Primary deficit, on the other hand, is the difference between fiscal deficit of the current year and the interest payment on the previous borrowings.